The morning of June 14, 1887, dawned bright and promising over the small town of Milbrook, Pennsylvania. Church bells rang across the valley, announcing what should have been the happiest day in the lives of Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore. By sunset, 23 people would be dead, and the survivors would carry scars that time could never heal. This is the true story of how celebration turned to catastrophe, and how one man's twisted mind transformed a wedding into a graveyard. The Whitmore family had arrived in Milbrook 3 generations earlier, building their fortune through iron manufacturing during the industrial boom. Thomas Whitmore, 28 years old, represented everything the American dream promised: educated, ambitious, and genuinely kind. His bride, Eleanor Fisher, came from a modest family of German immigrants who ran the town's general store. Their love story had captivated Milbrook for 2 years, a romance that crossed the invisible lines of class and heritage that still divided many American communities in that era. The wedding preparations had consumed the town for months. The Whitmore estate, a grand Victorian mansion on the hill overlooking Main Street, had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. White silk ribbons cascaded from the veranda columns. Tables laden with crystal and silver stretched across the manicured lawn. The kitchen buzzed with activity as cooks prepared a feast for 200 guests: roasted pheasant, glazed ham, fresh vegetables from local farms, and a 5-tier wedding cake that had taken 3 days to construct. What nobody knew was that among the hired staff moved a man whose hatred burned with an intensity that defied reason. His name was Henry Caldwell, and he had been working as a farmhand on the neighboring property for 8 months. To everyone who encountered him, Henry seemed unremarkable, quiet, efficient, perhaps a bit withdrawn, but nothing that raised alarm. He had volunteered to help with the wedding preparations, offering his services for the setup and serving. The Whitmores, grateful for the extra hands, had accepted without hesitation. But Henry Caldwell was far from ordinary. Behind his plain face and deferential manner lived something dark and broken. He had been born in Ohio to a factory worker who drank away his wages and a mother who died when Henry was 7. His childhood had been marked by violence and neglect, shaping him into something dangerous. He drifted from town to town, never staying long enough for anyone to see the warning signs. He had killed before 3 times in 3 different states, always moving on before suspicion could settle on him. His arrival in Milbrook had been accidental, but when he saw the prosperity of families like the Whitmores, something inside him snapped. He watched them from a distance, these people who had everything while he had nothing. The engagement announcement had been the trigger. He decided then that he would make them pay, make them all pay, for the injustice of a world that had given them so much and him so little. For months Henry planned meticulously. He studied the household routines, learned who would attend the wedding, understood the layout of the estate. He cultivated relationships with the other workers, always careful to appear helpful and harmless. He volunteered for tasks that would place him near the food, near the drinks, near the heart of the celebration. And he acquired what he needed: arsenic, readily available at any pharmacy as rat poison, no questions asked in those days before regulations. The morning of the wedding, Henry arrived at the estate at dawn. He worked alongside the other staff, setting up tables, arranging flowers, polishing silver. He smiled when spoken to, worked harder than anyone else, and waited for his moment. His hands were steady as he moved through the kitchen, as he stood near the punch bowls being prepared, as he calculated exactly how much poison would create maximum devastation without being immediately detected. The guests began arriving at noon. They came in carriages and on horseback, dressed in their finest clothes. Women wore elaborate gowns with bustles and trains, their hair piled high beneath decorative hats. Men sported dark suits and top hats, their moustaches waxed to perfection. Children ran across the lawn in their Sunday best, their laughter filling the summer air. The atmosphere buzzed with joy and anticipation. Thomas stood near the house, greeting guests as they arrived, his face bright with happiness. Eleanor was still upstairs, being helped into her wedding dress by her mother and sisters. The gown had been imported from New York, white satin with delicate lace sleeves, and a train that would trail 6 feet behind her. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the garden, where white wooden chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a flower-draped arbor. Reverend Marcus Holland, who had baptized Thomas as an infant, would officiate. The minister arrived an hour early, his Bible worn from decades of use, his expression serene as he surveyed the beautiful setting. At 1:15, Eleanor began her descent down the grand staircase. Her father, Otto Fischer, waited at the bottom, tears already forming in his eyes. Despite his rough hands and simple clothes, he had insisted on wearing his best suit rather than anything fancier. He carried himself with dignity. His daughter looked like an angel, and for a moment, all his years of struggle and hard work felt worthwhile. The guests took their seats, fanning themselves in the June heat. The string quartet began playing softly, filling the air with gentle music. Henry Caldwell stood near the refreshment tables, his face expressionless as he watched the pageantry unfold. In his pocket, his hand rested on a small glass vial, now empty. He had already done what he came to do. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her bouquet of white roses trembling slightly in her nervous hands. Thomas waited at the altar, his eyes never leaving her face. When Reverend Holland asked if anyone objected to the union, silence filled the garden. When the couple exchanged vows, several guests dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. When Thomas kissed his bride, applause erupted across the lawn. As the newlyweds walked back down the aisle together, the celebration truly began. The string quartet shifted to livelier music. Guests stood and mingled, congratulating the couple, embracing old friends, introducing themselves to new acquaintances. Children chased each other between the tables. The photographer, a man from Philadelphia with elaborate equipment, began arranging groups for formal portraits. The serving staff emerged from the house carrying trays of champagne and punch. There were 3 large crystal punch bowls, stationed at different points around the lawn, one near the main seating area, one by the dance floor, and one near the gift table. The punch was a specialty recipe that Eleanor's mother had perfected, a mixture of fruit juices, sugar, and just enough spirits to make it festive without being scandalous. It was sweet and refreshing, perfect for a warm summer day. Guests eagerly accepted glasses as the servers moved through the crowd. The punch bowls were refilled twice in the first half hour as people returned for seconds and thirds. Compliments flowed freely. "Simply delicious," declared Mrs. Harrison, the mayor's wife. "Best I've ever tasted," agreed Samuel Porter, owner of the town's largest dry goods store. Henry Caldwell watched from his position near the kitchen entrance, his face carefully neutral. He had poisoned all 3 punch bowls that morning, timing it perfectly when the kitchen staff had been briefly called away to help with a decorating crisis. The arsenic had dissolved completely into the sweet liquid, invisible and tasteless in the quantities he had used. He had calculated carefully, enough to kill, but not so much that anyone would notice an immediate bitter taste. Arsenic poisoning takes time. The first symptoms typically appear 30 minutes to 2 hours after ingestion, beginning with a burning sensation in the throat and stomach. Henry knew this. He had researched extensively, reading medical journals in the public library, learning exactly how the poison worked and what to expect. He planned to be gone long before anyone realized what was happening. At 3 o'clock, the wedding party gathered for formal photographs. Thomas and Eleanor stood at the center, surrounded by bridesmaids in pale blue dresses and groomsmen in matching dark suits. Behind them, the magnificent Victorian house rose against the clear sky. The photographer ducked under his black cloth, held up his hand for everyone to remain still, and captured an image that would become one of the most haunting documents of that terrible day. By 3:30, the first guest began to feel unwell. Margaret Whitmore, Thomas's aunt, suddenly turned pale and pressed her hand to her stomach. She excused herself quietly, thinking perhaps she had been too long in the sun. She wasn't the only one. Across the lawn, other guests were beginning to experience the same symptoms: nausea, stomach cramps, a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. At 4 o'clock, the dancing was supposed to begin, but the mood had shifted subtly. More people were sitting down, looking uncomfortable. The children who had been running and playing were now subdued. Some guests had already left, citing sudden illness. Others were heading to the house seeking the privacy of indoor facilities as their symptoms worsened. Eleanor noticed that something was amiss. She moved through the crowd with growing concern, asking if people needed anything, suggesting they rest in the shade. Thomas joined her, his joy beginning to give way to worry. By 4:30, the situation had deteriorated from concerning to alarming. 2 guests had collapsed completely and were being carried into the house and laid on sofas in the parlor. Dr. James Whitfield, who had been enjoying the celebration, was now moving frantically from person to person, his medical bag open, his face grave with concentration. He recognized the symptoms, but couldn't immediately identify a common cause: the burning pain, the violent nausea, the rapid weakening of multiple patients simultaneously. Thomas's younger sister, Catherine, had been one of the first to drink the punch, excited and thirsty from helping with last-minute preparations. She now lay in an upstairs bedroom, her face ashen, her breathing labored. Her mother knelt beside the bed, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, whispering prayers in a voice tight with fear. Catherine was only 16 years old, her whole life stretching before her just hours ago. In the garden, chaos was beginning to replace celebration. More guests were collapsing. Children were crying, calling for parents who were themselves too ill to respond. The beautiful tables with their pristine white linens were now supporting people too weak to stand. Crystal glasses lay shattered on the grass where they had fallen from trembling hands. The string quartet had stopped playing, the musicians themselves suffering from varying degrees of sickness. Dr. Whitfield finally made the connection. He stood in the center of the lawn, his voice cutting through the confusion with urgent authority. "The punch. Nobody drink the punch. Get away from those bowls." His command sent a ripple of understanding and horror through the crowd. This wasn't random illness. This was poisoning. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. Eleanor, standing beside him, swayed, and he caught her arm. "Did you drink any?" he demanded, his voice sharp with panic. She shook her head. "No, I've been too busy." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by guilt, as he looked around at the suffering people who were there to celebrate their happiness. Sheriff Robert Coleman had been at the wedding with his wife and 2 daughters. His wife was among the ill, lying on a bench with her head in his lap. He looked up at Dr. Whitfield with eyes that mixed professional assessment with personal terror. "Poison?" The doctor nodded grimly. "I believe so. Arsenic, if I had to guess based on the symptoms. Send someone for help immediately. We need every doctor within 20 miles here right now." Henry Caldwell had begun his retreat the moment Dr. Whitfield shouted the warning about the punch. He moved calmly through the confusion, just another worker in the chaos, walking steadily toward the service entrance. He had planned this part carefully, too. He would take the back path to the main road, be in the next town before anyone thought to account for all the staff. He felt no remorse, only a cold satisfaction. They would remember this day forever. But Henry hadn't counted on young Daniel Porter, the 14-year-old son of the dry goods store owner. Daniel had been assigned to help coordinate the servers and had been keeping mental track of who went where. He had noticed Henry near the punch bowls that morning when he wasn't supposed to be there. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Now, as panic spread and Daniel's own father lay groaning on the grass, poisoned, the boy's sharp mind made a connection. "Sheriff Coleman," Daniel's young voice carried across the lawn with surprising authority. "That farmhand, Henry Caldwell. I saw him by the punch bowls this morning when the kitchen was empty. He was acting strange." The sheriff's head snapped up. Through his fog of fear and confusion, training took over. He struggled to his feet, leaving his wife in the care of another guest, and scanned the crowd. Caldwell was nowhere to be seen. "Lock down the estate," Coleman shouted. "Nobody leaves until we account for everyone. Find Henry Caldwell." Several men who were still healthy enough to move quickly fanned out across the property. Others ran to the stable to prevent anyone from taking a horse. The beautiful celebration had transformed into a nightmarish crime scene in less than an hour. Inside the house, Dr. Whitfield was fighting a losing battle. Arsenic has no antidote. All he could do was try to induce vomiting in those still conscious enough to swallow ipecac, administer activated charcoal when he had it, and provide comfort to those too far gone for even these limited interventions. His hands shook as he moved from room to room, knowing that many of these people, his friends, his neighbors, people he had known all his life, were going to die no matter what he did. Eleanor's father, Otto Fischer, sat in the downstairs study, his face in his hands. He had drunk 3 glasses of punch, celebrating his daughter's happiness with gusto. Now the poison was working through his system, each minute bringing more pain, more weakness. He knew he was dying. Henry Caldwell made it as far as the tree line at the eastern edge of the property before he was spotted. John Mitchell, a farmhand from the neighboring estate who had been hired to help with horses, saw a figure moving quickly through the shadows and gave chase. Henry heard the shout behind him and broke into a run, abandoning any pretense of innocence. The pursuit crashed through the Pennsylvania woodland, frightening birds from their roosts and sending small animals scattering. Henry was fast, driven by desperation and adrenaline, but Mitchell was younger and knew this terrain intimately. Behind them, other men joined the chase, their anger and horror lending them speed despite the oppressive heat. Henry tried to lose them by cutting down toward the creek, hoping to confuse his trail, but his boots slipped on the mossy rocks. He stumbled, caught himself, and kept running. His breath came in ragged gasps. For the first time, fear penetrated his cold detachment. He hadn't planned for failure. He hadn't imagined being caught. The creek bed narrowed, forcing him up a steep embankment. His hands grabbed at roots and rocks, pulling himself upward, but the earth crumbled beneath his feet. Behind him, the pursuers were closing in. He could hear their voices, harsh and filled with rage. Mitchell reached the base of the embankment just as Henry scrambled over the top. What Henry hadn't known was that beyond the embankment lay the old quarry, abandoned for 15 years after the vein of limestone had played out. He emerged into the clearing at a full run and couldn't stop in time. His boots skidded on the loose gravel at the edge, his arms windmilled for balance, and then he was falling. The quarry was 40 feet deep, its bottom littered with broken rocks and stagnant water. The impact made a sound that would haunt Mitchell for the rest of his life, a wet crunch of bone and flesh meeting unforgiving stone. Henry Caldwell's body lay crumpled at the bottom, one leg bent at an impossible angle, blood already pooling beneath his head. He was still alive, but barely. His eyes stared up at the sky, no longer cold and calculating, but filled with confusion and pain. Mitchell and the others scrambled down the safer path into the quarry. By the time they reached him, Henry's breathing was shallow and erratic. Blood bubbled at his lips. Sheriff Coleman arrived moments later, having followed the sound of the chase. He knelt beside the dying man, his face hard as granite. "Why?" Coleman demanded. "Why did you do this?" Henry's eyes focused on the sheriff's face with effort. For a long moment he said nothing, and Coleman thought he might die without answering. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, words came. "They had everything. I had nothing. It wasn't fair." His voice held no remorse, only bitterness that stretched back through years of perceived injustice and self-created victimhood. "How many drank from the punch?" Coleman pressed, though he already feared the answer. Henry's lips curled into something that might have been a smile. "All of them. I poisoned all 3 bowls. All of them." Then his eyes went distant. His chest rattled once, and he was gone. The men stood in silence, looking down at the body of a man who had killed dozens out of nothing more than spite and twisted resentment. Back at the estate, the full horror of the situation was becoming clear. The house had become a makeshift hospital, every bed filled with the dying and sick. Doctors from neighboring towns had begun arriving, but they brought little hope. The most they could offer was morphine to ease the suffering of those too far gone to save. The cries of pain and grief echoed through rooms that hours ago had been filled with music and laughter. By 8 o'clock that evening, as the sun began to set over Milbrook in a sky streaked with red and gold, 17 people had died. Among them were Catherine Whitmore, her young life extinguished before it truly began; Otto Fischer, who would never see his grandchildren; Margaret Whitmore, who had raised 6 children of her own, 3 of those children attending their cousin's wedding; 2 young boys, brothers aged 7 and 9, who had been excited to wear their new suits and eat cake. Eleanor sat in her blood-stained wedding dress, blood-stained because she had been kneeling beside the dying, holding hands, offering what comfort she could. Her hair had fallen from its elaborate arrangement, hanging in tangled waves around her face. She moved through the house like a ghost, unable to process the magnitude of what had happened. unable to reconcile the joy of the morning with the nightmare of the evening. Thomas stood on the front porch, staring out at the scene of devastation. The beautiful decorations now looked obscene, mockeries of celebration. The untouched wedding cake sat on its table, 5 tiers of white perfection that no one would ever taste. Bodies were being carried out to waiting wagons, covered with sheets. The living stumbled past in various states of shock and illness. The night of June 14th stretched endlessly for those who survived. Dr. Whitfield and the other physicians worked without pause, their faces drawn with exhaustion and grief. By midnight, the death toll had risen to 20. By 3 in the morning, 23. The final count would not be known until dawn, when the last of the critically ill either fought their way back to life or succumbed to the poison coursing through their bodies. Eleanor had removed her wedding dress at some point during the night, though she couldn't remember when. She now wore a simple cotton dress borrowed from one of the household staff, her hair tied back in a loose braid. She moved through the rooms like an automaton, bringing water to the thirsty, holding bowls for those who were vomiting, whispering words of comfort that felt hollow even as she spoke them. Her own grief was so enormous that it had paralyzed her ability to feel anything at all. Thomas found her at dawn, sitting on the back stairs that led down to the kitchen garden. She was staring at nothing, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. He sat beside her without speaking. They had been married for less than 12 hours, and in that time their world had been shattered so completely that the pieces could never be reassembled into anything resembling what they had hoped for. "My father is dead," Eleanor said finally, her voice flat and emotionless. "Your sister is dead. 23 people came to celebrate with us, and they're dead." She turned to look at Thomas with eyes that held an accusation she couldn't voice. This had happened at their wedding, in their honor, because they had been happy. Thomas wanted to comfort her, to find words that would bridge the terrible chasm opening between them, but he had none. His own guilt was crushing. If he had never proposed, if they had eloped instead of having this elaborate celebration, if they had chosen a different day, a different venue, anything different, all those people would still be alive. The logic was flawed, and he knew it, but grief doesn't answer to logic. The sun rose over Milbrook on June 15th, revealing the full scope of the tragedy. The Whitmore estate, which yesterday morning had been the most beautiful place in the county, now looked like a battlefield. The lawn was trampled and littered with abandoned belongings. Blood and vomit stained the grass. The decorations hung limp and pathetic in the morning light. The wedding cake, that masterpiece that had taken 3 days to create, had collapsed in the heat, its tiers sliding into a melted heap of frosting and fondant. News of the massacre spread through Pennsylvania and beyond with shocking speed. Telegraph wires carried the story to Philadelphia, New York, Pittsburgh, and Washington. By afternoon, reporters were arriving in Milbrook, notebooks in hand, asking questions, taking photographs, turning personal tragedy into public spectacle. The town, numbering fewer than 800 residents, was overwhelmed by the attention and the horror. Sheriff Coleman, who had lost his wife and both daughters to the poison, threw himself into the investigation with grim determination. His grief would come later, for now he needed answers and accountability. Henry Caldwell's body had been brought back from the quarry and was being held in the town's small mortuary. Coleman searched through Caldwell's meager belongings at the boarding house where he had been staying, looking for anything that might explain the inexplicable. What he found was chilling. Caldwell had kept a journal, its pages filled with rambling observations about the town's wealthy families, sketches of the Whitmore estate, calculations about poison dosages copied from medical texts. There were entries dating back months, detailing his growing obsession with the unfairness of wealth distribution, his conviction that the prosperous were responsible for his failures, his determination to make them suffer. But there was nothing in the journal that offered real explanation, no trauma or injustice that could justify what he had done. He had simply been a man who nursed grievances until they consumed him, who blamed others for his own inadequacies, who chose to destroy rather than build. Coleman read the journal with disgust and threw it across the room. Even in death, Caldwell was providing no satisfaction, no catharsis. No way for the survivors to make sense of senseless evil. The funerals began on June 16th and continued for nearly a week. Milbrook's 3 churches were in constant use. The Presbyterian Church held services for the Whitmore family members. The Lutheran Church handled the Fisher family and other German immigrants. The Methodist Church accommodated everyone else. The town's 2 cemeteries were expanded hastily to handle the influx of bodies. Simple pine coffins were built by every carpenter within 20 miles, working around the clock. Thomas attended every funeral, standing at the back of churches, watching families bury loved ones who had come to celebrate his marriage. Eleanor could not bring herself to attend any of them. She remained in her childhood bedroom at her mother's house, staring at the wall, speaking to no one. Her mother, consumed by her own grief at losing her husband, had nothing left to offer her daughter. The story became national news. Newspapers across America ran headlines about the Wedding Day Massacre and the Pennsylvania poison plot. Editorial writers used the tragedy to support various political positions. Some blamed insufficient regulation of dangerous substances. Others blamed the breakdown of moral values in modern society. Still others used it as evidence that America was becoming too violent, too individualistic, too focused on wealth and status. Everyone had an opinion. No one had answers. By the end of June, the reporters had moved on to other stories. The national attention faded. Milbrook was left alone with its grief and its ghosts. Summer progressed with agonizing slowness. The Whitmore estate stood empty, its windows shuttered, its gardens returning to wilderness. Thomas could not bring himself to return there, could not face the rooms where people had died, the lawn where celebration had turned to horror. He stayed in a hotel in town, conducting his father's business affairs mechanically, going through motions without purpose or passion. Eleanor remained with her mother, but the relationship between them had fractured beyond repair. Her mother blamed Eleanor in ways she would never speak aloud, but that hung heavy in the silence between them. If Eleanor hadn't been so ambitious, wanting such a grand wedding, if she had been content with a simple ceremony, if she had married someone from her own class instead of reaching for the Whitmore wealth, the unspoken accusations were louder than any words. Thomas and Eleanor saw each other rarely in those weeks after the funerals. When they did meet, their conversations were stilted and painful. They were legally married but felt like strangers. The foundation they had built their relationship on, joy, hope, shared dreams of the future, had been obliterated. What remained was trauma and guilt and the constant presence of ghosts. In mid-July, Eleanor's mother announced that she was selling the general store and moving to Philadelphia to live with her sister. She would leave at the end of the month. Eleanor was welcome to come with her, she said, though her tone suggested she hoped Eleanor would refuse. Eleanor, understanding that her presence was a daily reminder of her mother's loss, agreed to stay in Milbrook. The distance between them had become insurmountable. Thomas made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He would not reopen the Whitmore estate. Instead, he would donate it to the town to be converted into a hospital. Milbrook had no proper medical facility, and the tragedy had made clear how desperately one was needed. Dr. Whitfield, who had worked so heroically to save lives on that terrible day, would oversee its conversion and serve as its chief physician. The mansion would be gutted and rebuilt to serve the living rather than remind everyone of the dead. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some praised Thomas's generosity and forward thinking. Others saw it as an insult to the memory of those who had died there, a way of erasing the tragedy rather than honoring it. Thomas didn't care about public opinion. He needed to do something. Anything that might transform horror into something useful. He couldn't bring back the dead, but perhaps he could help the living. Eleanor heard about the hospital donation from a neighbor before Thomas told her himself. It was another sign of how disconnected they had become. When he finally came to see her, she was sitting in the small parlor of the house she had grown up in, surrounded by packing crates. Her mother was leaving in 3 days. "You should have told me," Eleanor said without preamble. Thomas sat down across from her, noting how thin she had become, how the light had gone from her eyes. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm not thinking clearly about anything these days." They sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes before Eleanor spoke again. "I don't think we can stay married. The words hung between them, both terrible and inevitable. Thomas felt a surge of panic followed immediately by relief, then guilt at the relief. "Eleanor, we can get through this. We just need time." But even as he said it, he knew he didn't believe it. She shook her head slowly. "We're not the people who fell in love 2 years ago. Those people died on June 14th along with everyone else. What we are now, we're just broken things that remind each other of the worst day of our lives." She was right, and they both knew it. In the Victorian America of 1887, divorce was scandalous and difficult, but not impossible. Given the extraordinary circumstances, it could be arranged quietly. They would both be free to try to build new lives from the wreckage of the old ones. They would both carry the scars forever, but perhaps separately they could heal in ways they never could together. The legal proceedings took 3 months. Thomas's family lawyers handled everything discreetly. The grounds were incompatibility resulting from shared trauma, phrased carefully to avoid scandal. By October, the marriage that had lasted less than a day was legally dissolved. Eleanor took her maiden name back. The small monetary settlement Thomas provided ensured she would never face poverty. Eleanor left Milbrook in early November, moving to Pittsburgh where no one knew her story. She took a position as a seamstress in a dress shop, using skills her mother had taught her years ago. She lived in a boarding house for respectable working women, kept to herself and tried to forget. Some days she succeeded for hours at a time. Thomas threw himself into the hospital project with single-minded intensity. He worked alongside the contractors, learning carpentry and plumbing, exhausting himself physically so he might sleep at night. The grand ballroom became the main ward. The formal dining room was converted into surgical theatres. The parlours became private rooms for patients who could afford them. The kitchen was expanded and modernized. The Whitmore Memorial Hospital opened its doors in March of 1888, 9 months after the tragedy. Dr. Whitfield hired 3 nurses and 2 additional doctors. The town rallied around the new facility, donating equipment and supplies. Families who had lost loved ones in the poisoning found some comfort in knowing that good had emerged from evil, that future lives might be saved in the place where so many had been lost. At the opening ceremony, Thomas gave a brief speech. He spoke about how tragedy could either destroy communities or strengthen them. He thanked everyone who had contributed to the hospital's creation. He named each of the 23 victims, ensuring they would be remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals who had mattered. The years that followed brought gradual healing, though neither Thomas nor Eleanor would ever be whole in the way they once were. Time did not erase the memories, but it did soften their sharpest edges, made them bearable to carry. Both learned to live with ghosts, to function despite the weight of what they had lost. Eleanor found unexpected solace in her work. Her talent with needle and thread brought her to the attention of Mrs. Catherine Morrison, owner of Pittsburgh's most exclusive dress shop. By 1890, Eleanor had been promoted to head seamstress, overseeing a staff of 12 women. She designed gowns for the city's elite, attending fittings and consultations, building a reputation for excellence. Her past remained hidden. She told people she was widowed when they asked about her unmarried status, and no one questioned further. In the spring of 1891, Eleanor met Marcus Webb, a bookkeeper for one of Pittsburgh's steel mills. He was quiet, kind and patient, everything Henry Caldwell had not been. Marcus had his own tragedy. His first wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, leaving him with a young son named Peter. He understood grief and the long shadow it cast. Their courtship was slow and careful, both of them damaged enough to proceed with caution. Eleanor told Marcus everything before he proposed. She showed him newspaper clippings she had saved from 1887, explained about the wedding that became a massacre, about her brief marriage and subsequent divorce. She expected him to withdraw, to find her history too dark, too complicated. Instead, he took her hands and said, "We've both survived terrible things. Maybe that's exactly why we can build something good together." They married in a simple ceremony at City Hall in December 1891, with Peter as their only witness. Eleanor became a stepmother and embraced the role with unexpected joy. She had thought motherhood would never be part of her life. Now she helped Peter with his schoolwork, mended his clothes, listened to his stories about his days. In 1893, she gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, after Marcus's mother. 2 years later, a son arrived, named Otto after the father Eleanor had lost. Thomas's path was different, but parallel in its slow return to life. The hospital consumed him for 3 years after its opening. He learned medicine informally, assisting Dr. Whitfield in surgeries, studying anatomy texts, understanding disease and treatment. He found purpose in helping others, in alleviating suffering where he could. The work was sometimes heartbreaking. Patients died despite their best efforts, but it was also meaningful in ways his previous life as a businessman had never been. In 1892, Thomas met Anna Hartley, a trained nurse who had moved to Milbrook from Boston to work at the hospital. She was practical, unsentimental, and remarkably capable. She knew Thomas's history, everyone in Milbrook did, but she treated him as he was in the present, not as a victim of past tragedy. She had no patience for self-pity or dwelling on what couldn't be changed. Her direct manner was exactly what Thomas needed. Their relationship developed slowly over shared work. They assisted in surgeries together, consulted on difficult cases, worked night shifts when epidemics of influenza or scarlet fever overwhelmed the hospital. Somewhere in those long hours of collaboration, respect turned to affection, and affection deepened into love. Thomas proposed in the hospital's small garden in June 1893, exactly 6 years after the massacre. Anna accepted on the condition that they never have a large wedding. They were married by a justice of the peace with Dr. Whitfield and his wife as witnesses. Thomas and Anna had 2 children, both sons, born in 1894 and 1896. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, patient and attentive in ways his own father had never been. He read to his boys every night, taught them to fish in the creek behind their modest house, answered their endless questions about how things worked. He was determined that they would grow up with values grounded in service and compassion rather than wealth and status. The Whitmore Memorial Hospital became a model for rural medical facilities throughout Pennsylvania. Dr. Whitfield trained young doctors there, establishing it as an informal teaching hospital. Thomas continued to fund its operations through the inheritance from his family's iron business, which he had converted into a trust specifically for that purpose. He never returned to manufacturing. His life's work became ensuring that quality medical care was available to everyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay. Both Thomas and Eleanor occasionally heard news of each other over the years, usually through mutual acquaintances or newspaper mentions. Neither attempted to make contact. The past they shared was too painful to revisit, even in the service of closure or reconciliation. They had built separate lives, found new loves, created new families. Opening old wounds served no purpose. In 1897, 10 years after the tragedy, Milbrook held a memorial service for the victims. A monument was unveiled in the town square, a simple marble obelisk engraved with 23 names and the date June 14, 1887. Thomas attended with Anna and their children. Eleanor, living in Pittsburgh, did not make the trip, though she spent that day in quiet reflection, thinking of her father and all the others who had died. The ceremony was brief and dignified. Reverend Holland, now elderly, but still serving his congregation, offered prayers. Dr. Whitfield spoke about how the community had transformed tragedy into something positive through the hospital. The mayor declared June 14th an official day of remembrance. Children from the school choir sang hymns. No one mentioned Henry Caldwell by name. He had been buried in an unmarked grave in the corner of the paupers' cemetery, deliberately forgotten. As Thomas stood before the memorial, his sons on either side of him, Anna's hand in his, he realized something profound. He would never stop grieving for what had been lost that day. Catherine, his sister, would always be 16 in his memory. Forever young, forever on the edge of a life she never got to live. Eleanor's father, who had welcomed him so warmly into their family, deserved to have met his grandchildren. All 23 people deserved lives they never lived. But he had also learned that surviving tragedy didn't mean forgetting it or pretending it hadn't happened. It meant carrying it forward, letting it inform how you lived, what you valued, how you treated others. By the turn of the century, both Thomas and Eleanor had achieved a measure of peace. The scars remained. They would always remain, but neither was defined solely by that terrible day in June 1887. They had built meaningful lives from the ruins, had loved and been loved, had raised children who knew nothing of poison or massacres, only the warmth of homes filled with care and attention. Eleanor's dress shop had become one of Pittsburgh's finest by 1900. She employed 30 seamstresses and had expanded into bridal gowns, a decision she had initially resisted but eventually embraced. She designed each wedding dress with meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that brides felt beautiful on what should be the happiest day of their lives. There was a strange redemption in it, helping others have the joy that had been stolen from her. Her children thrived. Peter, now a young man of 22, was studying law at the University of Pittsburgh. Catherine, at 7, was bright and curious, forever asking questions about everything she encountered. Little Otto, at 5, was gentle and artistic, happiest when drawing or building elaborate structures with wooden blocks. Marcus continued his steady work at the steel mill, providing stability and unwavering support. Their home was modest, but filled with laughter and music. Marcus played piano on weekends, and the whole family would gather around to sing. Eleanor had made peace with her mother before the older woman died in 1898. The reconciliation had been difficult, requiring both women to acknowledge how they had failed each other in the aftermath of tragedy. They had managed 3 years of regular correspondence, awkward at first but gradually warming, before her mother's sudden heart attack ended the conversation permanently. Eleanor grieved, but felt grateful they had at least attempted to bridge the divide. Thomas's life had settled into satisfying patterns. The hospital continued to grow and excel under his and Dr. Whitfield's combined leadership. Anna had retired from nursing after their second son was born, but remained actively involved in hospital administration and fundraising. Their sons, Thomas Jr. and William, were 6 and 4 respectively, energetic boys who knew their father as a man who helped sick people get better, who came home tired but always made time to play. The iron manufacturing business that had made the Whitmore fortune had been sold to a larger corporation in 1895. Thomas had taken the proceeds and established the Whitmore Foundation, dedicated to improving public health throughout Pennsylvania. The foundation funded sanitation improvements, vaccination programs, and scholarships for medical students from poor families. It was work that gave Thomas more satisfaction than any business deal ever had. In 1905, Thomas received an unexpected letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but the return address was Pittsburgh. Inside, Eleanor had written briefly, formally, congratulating him on the Foundation's recent recognition by the State Medical Society. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she was doing well, that she had built a good life. She hoped he had done the same. Thomas stared at the letter for a long time, memories flooding back with unexpected intensity. He showed it to Anna, who read it thoughtfully before handing it back. "Will you respond?" she asked. Thomas considered. "I think I will. After all these years, I think I can." He wrote back, equally brief and formal, thanking her for the kind words, expressing genuine happiness that she had found peace and prosperity. He told her about the hospital, about his sons, about how Milbrook had recovered from 1887 and become a thriving community again. They exchanged 3 more letters over the next 2 years, gradually warming from formal courtesy to something resembling friendship. They would never be close, too much history stood between them, but they could acknowledge each other's survival, each other's hard-won happiness. There was comfort in knowing that the other person who truly understood what June 14, 1887, had meant, had also managed to build something good from the wreckage. In 1910, the Whitmore Memorial Hospital celebrated its 20th anniversary with a major expansion. A new wing doubled its capacity, and state-of-the-art surgical equipment was installed. Thomas, now 51 years old, gave a speech at the dedication ceremony. He spoke about how the hospital had saved hundreds of lives over 2 decades, how it had trained dozens of doctors and nurses, how it had become a source of pride for Milbrook and surrounding communities. He did not mention the tragedy that had led to the hospital's creation. Everyone there knew the story. It was part of local history, taught in schools, remembered each June 14th, but it no longer defined the institution. The hospital had transcended its dark origins to become something purely positive, a place of healing rather than horror. That transformation, Thomas believed, was the truest victory over Henry Caldwell's hateful legacy. Eleanor read about the anniversary in the Pittsburgh papers. She thought about attending but decided against it. Some distances were better maintained. Instead, she made an anonymous donation to the Whitmore Foundation, a substantial sum that would fund scholarships for 10 nursing students. It was her own way of honoring the past while supporting the future. Both Thomas and Eleanor lived into old age, dying within months of each other in 1934. He at 75, she at 74. Neither ever forgot June 14, 1887, but neither had let that day steal the rest of their lives. They had survived the unsurvivable, had carried unimaginable grief, had found ways to transform poison into medicine, death into life, tragedy into meaning. The Whitmore Memorial Hospital continued to serve Milbrook for decades, eventually becoming part of a larger regional health system but retaining its original name and mission. The monument in the town square still stands today, though most people who pass it don't know the full story of what happened that June afternoon. The names are still legible, carved deep into marble, 23 people who came to a wedding and never went home. History remembers the day as the Milbrook massacre, one of the deadliest mass poisonings in American history. But for Thomas and Eleanor, who lived through it and beyond it, the story was never just about death and destruction. It was also about resilience, about the human capacity to endure unthinkable trauma and still choose to build rather than destroy, to love rather than hate, to hope rather than despair. In that choice, made daily over decades, lay their true victory over the darkness that Henry Caldwell had tried to impose on the world. They had refused to let evil have the final word. They had insisted, through the simple act of continuing to live with purpose and compassion, that light could emerge, even from the deepest darkness. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.